There are mornings when fate doesn't knock politely on your door with a bell, but slams straight into your chest, forcing your whole life to change course. That morning, the sky over Boston was as gray as a bruised palm after a cold night, and Autumn Miller, 27 years old, was running as if her very soul was being chased by an entire season of unpaid debts. Not because she liked exercise, not because she was training for a marathon, but because the only bus that could take her to the most important interview of her life had pulled away just 1 minute and 30 seconds before her eyes, while she was fumbling to get change from a street vendor who didn't have coins, and because her wallet held only $2.15, not enough to call an Uber, and because she had nothing left except hope and a pair of cheap old shoes so worn out that the leather at the heel was about to split. She ran 8 blocks, ran past the smell of gasoline, past blaring angry horns, past the pitying glance of a newspaper seller. Every step was a gasp for air. Sweat stung the back of her neck. Her feet throbbed as the thin skin beneath the paper-thin soles of her shoes scraped against the unforgiving concrete. By the 9th block, as Autumn dashed across a red light, life struck her like a hammer. She crashed hard into a man glued to his phone. In an instant, it all exploded, the brutal impact, her handbag scattering papers, flying like autumn leaves, and the sharp crack of shoes that had already endured far too much. She fell dazed and stunned. One bare foot scraped raw, one heel dangling like a useless shard of plastic. "Damn it!" she cried, looking up at the man who had knocked her down. He stood tall, cold, immaculate. A crisp white shirt pressed to perfection, a charcoal gray designer suit, a handsome face, sharp as a blade, no outstretched hand. "No, I'm sorry. Didn't anyone teach you to watch where you're going?" His voice was precise, calm, as if he were adjusting his schedule, not shoving someone onto the pavement. Autumn swallowed hard, gripping the broken heel with trembling fingers. You ruined my shoes," she whispered, tears welling. "I have an interview at 9 o'clock, and now—" "So, what?" He cut her off. "If you're really good, a pair of shoes won't decide anything." She stared at him, unblinking. She had met heartless people before, but this level of coldness was on another tier. "Well, that philosophy probably belongs on a coffee mug sold with a side of muffins," she snapped, gathering her things. "Thanks for nothing." The man's lips curved, whether into a smirk or a smile she couldn't tell, and he walked away, leaving behind someone whose pride had been scraped raw like her heel. Autumn stood alone, clutching her broken shoes, her dignity wounded. She looked down at her bare foot, then lifted her chin. "Damn it, I'll go barefoot." When she pushed through the glass doors of Bradford and Langston, the clock read 8:58 a.m. 2 minutes before her interview, Autumn Miller, hair disheveled, sweat clinging to her back blouse sticking to her skin, walked barefoot across the marble floor. The receptionist, crimson lips, flawless eyeliner sharp as a blade, stared, stunned. Interview for the executive assistant position. Autumn exhaled, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your name?" the receptionist asked, her tone colder than the air conditioner. "It wouldn't be skip upstairs, besurned." Autumn Miller. She was directed to the waiting room. The moment she opened the door, her heart froze. 21 women, each looking as though they had stepped out of a luxury perfume campaign. Silk dresses, designer heels, perfect makeup, not a wrinkle, not a drop of sweat. And her, barefoot, hair tousled, looking like she had just crawled out of a nightmare. A blonde girl glanced at her from head to toe, then pretended to fiddle with her phone, the camera flashing. "Oh my God, she really is barefoot," someone whispered. Autumn bit down hard on her lip. She sat pulling her bag over her feet. She wanted to vanish, to go home, to stop the world. But she had come this far. She whispered, "I'm here. I won't run." The sharp rhythm of leather shoes echoed across the wooden floor. Autumn lifted her head, and her heart clenched tight. It was him, the man who had knocked her down, the one who had walked away without a glance back. In a sleek black suit, striding with confidence, eyes sharp as a blade, he entered the waiting room, without a flicker of surprise, without expression. And then their eyes met. Cold, piercing, empty. Autumn couldn't stop the words from slipping out. "Oh, great. Not you again, mister? I don't apologize." A few women stifled laughter behind their hands. Others stared as if Autumn had just signed her career's death sentence. He stopped, looked at her, just for a few seconds, but long enough for her heartbeat to pound like a drum. Then he turned away, said nothing. "Autumn Miller," the receptionist's voice rang out. She rose, barefoot, broken shoes in hand, and stepped into the room of destiny. There are people who walk into our lives as obstacles, but sometimes they're the very ones who reshape the faith we have in ourselves. As the interview room door closed behind her, Autumn Miller swallowed hard, each barefoot step across the wooden floor echoing like a drum of war. The meeting room was wide, bright, and so quiet that the ticking of the clock could be heard with each passing second. Along the oak table sat 3 interviewers flipping through folders, and at the very center, leaning back in a black leather chair with light catching his sharp features, was the man from earlier. He lifted his eyes, their gaze collided. Not angry now, but not gentle either, still sharp as a knife, still cold as a frozen lake. Autumn stood there, her breath heavy. This jerk was her interviewer. She wanted to bolt, but then a voice in her head snapped. You didn't run barefoot through half the city just to turn back now. His name was Lucas Bradford, 34 years old, CEO of Bradford and Langston Enterprises, heir to a financial empire and the cold-blooded symbol of Wall Street. "Miss Miller," he said, face impassive, "it seems you've had quite an unusual morning." Autumn forced a weak smile. If you're about to say showing up barefoot to an interview is a bold fashion statement, then I'll clarify right now. This was not a PR strategy. One of the panelists let out a quiet chuckle. Lucas did not. "All right," he said, flipping through her file. "Bachelor's degree in economics from Northern Vermont University. Work experience at a coffee shop, a thrift store, and a veterinary clinic. No office experience." Autumn arched an eyebrow. "I also reorganized the books for the pet store owner, taking her from sticky notes and cat smell to neat Excel spreadsheets. I call that evolution." For the first time, Lucas looked up with something other than disdain. There was curiosity. "So, why do you want to be an executive assistant?" he asked. Autumn met his eyes. "Because my fridge is empty. Because the electricity will be cut off if I don't pay by Monday. And because I don't believe I was born to make lattes forever. Though I do make a pretty good heart shape." Lucas tapped his fingers lightly against the table. The other executives straightened in their seats, not dismissing her answer, but listening. "Do you think you're suited for a serious environment like this?" "Absolutely," Autumn nodded. "I once had to care for a depressed cat and a customer who screamed at me every morning. I call that psychological training." Lucas leaned back, his gaze flicking down to her bare feet. This time, there was no contempt, just observation. "You know," he said, his voice low, "and even no one walks in here barefoot." Autumn shrugged. "And I'm guessing no one else walked in here with enough courage after having their shoes broken by the CEO himself, who then left them on the sidewalk." The room froze, tension thick in the air. Lucas paused. Then very faintly, the corner of his mouth lifted. The first trace of a smile since she'd met him. The interview lasted 13 minutes. Not long, but every second tested the strength of her resolve. When she finally left the room, Autumn walked without looking back, though her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. The next afternoon, Autumn was reheating coffee in her tiny apartment when her phone buzzed. "Hello, this is Christine from the HR department at Bradford and Langston. I'm calling to inform you you've been selected." She nearly dropped the mug. What? "You'll start next Monday at 8 a.m. Position executive assistant to the CEO." Coffee spilled across the floor, but she didn't notice. She'd been chosen. By him. He had chosen her. Monday morning, she arrived 20 minutes early. Her blazer was cheap but clean, her hair neatly brushed, and she wore a new pair of shoes bought with the very last of her money. But what steadied her steps wasn't the shoes. It was faith. On the 24th floor, her desk was set right outside the CEO's office. A polished brass nameplate gleamed on the door, "Lucas Bradford, CEO." Autumn whispered to herself. The game officially begins. There are closed spaces that make you feel suffocated, yet sometimes they open a door to truths never spoken before. By her 3rd day at work, Autumn Miller still hadn't gotten used to the whirring groan of the photocopier, or the constant ping of the internal email system that clanged in her ears like metal striking metal. But at least she had learned how to make Lucas's coffee exactly the way he liked it. Strong, no sugar, no cream, and never a minute late. Does he have his biological clock connected to his wristwatch by Bluetooth or something she once muttered under her breath? From her desk outside his glass office, she could hear the measured sound of Lucas's footsteps as he moved inside. Each time the glass door opened, a cold burst of air conditioning and the faint scent of sandalwood drifted out. Still the same coldness, still the same way he never looked at anyone for more than 3 seconds unless he was evaluating them. Still those eyes. That tested her patience in ways she couldn't explain. That noon, Autumn hurried down to the basement to collect some printed documents since the copier on the 24th floor was broken. On her way back, the lights in the elevator flickered, then went out. "Please don't." With a loud ping, the elevator jolted and stopped between the 12th and 13th floors. She was trapped. She pressed the emergency button. No response. Then a light cough came from the other side of the cabin. Autumn turned her head. Lucas Bradford was standing there. "You're here too." Clearly he replied, eyes fixed on his phone. Autumn turned back quickly, determined not to look flustered. Why on earth did fate have to lock her in a steel box with the man who'd once broken her shoes? "Maintenance is probably working on it," Lucas said flatly. She forced a smile. "This is my first time being stuck in an elevator. Also, my first time wearing a $30 blazer and standing next to a man in a $3,000 suit in a space the size of a closet." Lucas glanced at her, his eyes flickering with a trace of amusement. "You always talk this much when you're nervous." "No, only when I'm trying not to panic." Silence settled over them. The cabin felt smaller by the second. They were only an arm's length apart. "You seem to handle pressure pretty well," he said suddenly. "Surprised?" "No, just not many people talk to me like you do." "Oh, I forgot," she teased, tilting her head, half joking, half serious. "I'm talking to the man who nearly cost me my job and destroyed the only pair of shoes I owned in 3 years. Lucas laughed. For the first time, Autumn heard his real laugh. Not forced, not cold. "You're not afraid of me. Maybe I should be. But you know, once you've lived in an apartment with no heat, no electricity, and your only meal was a stale pack of ramen, a cold CEO isn't all that terrifying." Lucas went silent. But it wasn't the arrogant silence of a powerful CEO. It was the silence of a man, loosening a mask he had been forced to wear for too long. The dim light cast shadows over his strong features, and his eyes, once so icy, now clouded with something unspoken, something fragile. Then his voice came, low, slow, like every word dragged out an old wound. "I once slept on the office sofa for 3 months after my mother passed. Hospital, terminal cancer. The house was huge, but after the funeral it was so empty I couldn't stand it." Autumn turned toward him. The sharpness on her face softened her eyes, glowing with a pure gentleness. "I had to learn how to live with emptiness too," she whispered. She lifted her gaze to the ceiling of the cabin, as if redrawing a memory she had buried deep. "My dad died of a stroke when I was 17. And my mom, she never knew what a day off was. She worked night shifts as a waitress at 2 restaurants, then cleaned hotel rooms in the morning just to pay debts and put me through college. She used to tell me, 'You may not have money, but never let anyone take away your voice.'" Lucas turned his head, his eyes no longer piercing, but resting on something fragile. Something real, something close. The elevator still hadn't moved, but the suffocating feeling had vanished. In its place was a different silence. The silence of 2 people who had walked alone for too long, finally hearing echoes inside each other. 2 human beings, 2 worlds. But in that moment, between cold steel and dim light, they weren't CEO and assistant. They were just Lucas and Autumn, survivors of loss. And for the first time, they didn't have to lie about it. After almost 15 minutes, the elevator shook slightly and began moving again. When the doors opened, Lucas stepped out first. But then he turned back, holding the door for a beat. "Thank you for not pretending," he said, his gaze softer than ever before. "Not many people manage that around me." Autumn nodded, a small smile, not forced, not performed. Not pretending is a survival skill, especially for someone who once walked into an interview barefoot. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Autumn realized he was no longer just the man who broke her shoes. He was the first person in years who made her want to tell the truth. There are moments that seem like trials, but they become stepping stones that push us into the light. And from that very light, envy begins to creep in. One early autumn morning, a veil of mist clung to the glass windows on the 24th floor. Autumn arrived as usual, holding a strong cup of coffee for Lucas. Her nerves calmer now, after nearly a month on the job. But today felt different. Lucas motioned for her to step into his office. On his desk sat a thick stack of documents. "This afternoon there's a meeting with the board. You'll present this data," he said curtly. Autumn froze. I'll present." Lucas didn't look up, still scanning the papers. "Yes? I'll be tied up in negotiations with the Tokyo shareholders, and I want them to hear from someone with a different perspective." Her breath shortened. "But I'm not an analyst. I'm just the person who turned a barefoot interview into a show of character." Lucas finally looked up, his eyes locking on hers. "I trust you." Autumn clutched the stack of papers, her heart screaming to run, but her feet didn't move. 3 p.m. Boardroom 25th floor. The air was heavy with expensive suits, stiff ties, and scrutinizing stares. Around the table sat the marketing director, the finance head, and Rebecca Sloan, senior finance manager, her thin smile sharp as a hidden blade inside a rose. Lucas was absent, every gaze turned toward Autumn. She stood, hands trembling slightly. "Good afternoon. My name is Autumn Miller, and yes, I'm not a professional data analyst." She began, her voice quivering, but her eyes steady. "But if you give me a few minutes, I'll tell you a story about numbers that speak." She clicked to the first slide and began presenting the Q3 revenue data, using metaphors no one expected. Q1 is like the first date excitement, passion sales rising high. Q2, like after a fight, everything plummets. But Q3, that's when both sides finally sit down and talk, and revenue starts to climb again. A few chuckles broke out. Rebecca folded her arms, her eyes icy. Autumn continued pacing alongside the table, pointing to graphs. The way the West Coast email campaign was adjusted, it's like changing the soundtrack of a film. It doesn't alter the plot, but it changes how the audience feels. And the market's reaction proves it. The finance director gave a subtle nod. Another exec scribbled notes. Rebecca's hand clenched tight around her leather notebook. Autumn closed with a quiet smile. "I know I don't bring flashy financial jargon, but I do bring clarity. And if this company needs anything right now, it's the ability to see value in things that aren't perfect." The room fell silent for a beat. Then, the first clap, followed by nods of approval. One board member smiled, short presentation, but extremely impressive. Rebecca's expression stayed calm, but her eyes betrayed fury. When Autumn left the boardroom, it felt like she had finally exhaled after weeks of holding her breath. But the joy didn't last. In the break room, she noticed whispers, quick glances, conversations that stopped when she entered. Someone had begun to spread the story. In the center of the room, Rebecca stepped forward with an espresso in hand. "Your presentation was inspiring," she said with a razor-thin smile, though a bit theatrical. "Thank you," Autumn replied calmly. "I tend to be a little too real." "A strange thing in an office, isn't it?" Rebecca tilted her head, her gaze slicing like glass. "You're moving too fast, Autumn. Too far. Shortcuts always come with a price." That afternoon, Lucas stopped by Autumn's desk. The board was very impressed, he said quietly. "Well done." Autumn smiled, but a lump caught in her throat. "Did you hear what they've been saying?" Lucas paused, then looked at her seriously. "Rumors don't create truth, but the way we face them, that defines who we are." Autumn nodded, but inside an uneasy wave rose up. Talent, no matter how bright, is always a thorn to those who thrive in the shadows. And for the first time she understood, this wasn't just a job. This was a battlefield. There are journeys that don't just change the scenery, they quietly shift two hearts closer, even if neither dares to admit it. Friday afternoon, Autumn was struggling to organize the pile of messy documents on her desk when Lucas approached. He wore a light gray shirt, held a blue folder in his hand, and his eyes, softer than usual. "Next Wednesday I'm flying to New York," he said evenly. "Meeting with Hamilton and Green. The deal is on the verge of collapse." Autumn looked up, blinking. And I want you to come with me." Silence. A silence long enough for the hum of the air conditioner over the office plants to be heard. "Me in what capacity?" "As my assistant, and as the one who kept the board from checking their watches for 15 minutes during last week's presentation." Autumn opened her mouth to decline, but then she closed it. In his eyes she saw not just an order, but a rare, genuine trust. Wednesday morning, Boston Airport. Autumn arrived 2 hours early, suitcase rolling steadily by her side. She wore an old trench coat, her hair tied neatly, and the very shoes whose heels had once snapped, now repaired with new soles. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, impeccable, calm. But when his eyes found her, something in them softened even if his lips didn't say so. They sat side by side on the plane. The 2-hour flight to Manhattan passed quietly, at least for Lucas. Autumn, on the other hand, whispered key terms from the contract under her breath, sketching department relationship diagrams onto napkins. "Do you always talk to printouts like that?" Lucas asked, tilting his head. "Only when I'm about to talk to people who could cost the company millions with a single nod." Lucas smirked. "That's scary." "Not exactly, but it does feel a bit like walking into an exam where the proctor is the guy who once broke my shoes. And now he's grading me." Lucas let out a low chuckle, a real one, deep and brief. In New York, they went straight to the hotel. The receptionist looked uneasy. "Mr. Bradford, there's been a mistake. The system booked a double room for Mr. and Mrs. Bradford, and the hotel is fully booked tonight." Autumn froze. "What?" Lucas looked from the clerk to her. "I'll call my assistant." "Don't," Autumn cut in. "We're adults. 1 night, 2 beds, no problem." That's what she said, but her heart was pounding out of rhythm. The room was spacious, bathed in warm, golden light. 2 double beds lined with crisp white sheets. Lucas showered first. When he came out, he wore a gray t-shirt and track pants. So casually human that Autumn almost forgot this was the strict CEO she knew. "Want to order food?" he asked, towel in hand. "As long as it's not foie gras or anything that needs a dictionary to translate." They ordered pizza, sat on the sofa. A movie played in the background, though neither paid attention. Autumn suddenly laughed. "You know, I once thought you didn't know how to smile." Lucas lifted his gaze from his glass of wine. "And I once thought you didn't know how to stop talking." "Fair enough." Autumn grinned, her eyes sparkling. A gentle quiet settled like morning mist lingering after dawn. The TV flickered on the wall, but neither cared. The New York night stretched wide like a jeweled carpet. Below, the city bustled restlessly. Up here, there were only 2 people, 2 glasses of red wine, and a silence, no longer awkward. Autumn leaned back into the sofa, pulling her knees up, swirling her wine as if listening to her own story. Lucas sat a short distance away, his eyes occasionally drifting toward her, not forced, not hidden. "This city makes me feel small," Autumn murmured, as if confessing to herself. Lucas set his glass down, resting his elbows on his knees. "And me? Every time I come here, I remember lying awake dreading rooms full of hostile partners." "You're losing sleep from nerves." She tilted her head, half teasing, half amazed. "When I first took over the company," he admitted, "I didn't know how to stay calm when people waited for my nod to sign contracts worth millions." Autumn chuckled softly. "And I once trembled asking my landlord for rent money from a woman who kept 20 cats." Lucas smiled faintly. "Sounds more terrifying." The distance between them hadn't changed, but the space felt different. No longer boss and assistant, no longer shoebreaker and the fallen girl. Just 2 people in a city that never sleeps, finally allowing themselves to rest. After a pause, Lucas's voice came deep, sincere. "You did well today." Autumn looked at him, no need to ask really. His eyes already answered. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think I'd survive." Lucas tilted his head. "You didn't just survive. You made them look at the substance, not the surface." Autumn grew quiet, surprised, shy, but inside something warm stirred, not from the wine. He turned toward her, not sudden, not forceful, but clear. His eyes, no longer cold, no longer guarded, searching as if asking silently, "May I come closer?" His hand rested lightly on hers. Autumn looked down. She didn't pull away, but she didn't grip back either. She could feel something in his gaze, not hunger for conquest, but a longing to be understood. Lucas leaned down slightly, not enough to kiss, but close enough for her to feel the tug-of-war in her breath. Autumn shook her head gently. "We shouldn't go further," yet she whispered, not firm, not a rejection, just a pause, because part of her wasn't ready to gamble. Lucas drew back his eyes, not sad, just quiet. "Because I'm your boss. Because if this is real, Autumn lifted her eyes clear as glass. Then it deserves to begin on a day when we're not in suits with contracts stuffed in our pockets. They remained a long while, silent but not distant. Lucas stood first, adjusting the pillows on his bed, then turned back to her. "Good night, Autumn." "Good night, Lucas." 2 beds 3 steps apart. But between their hearts was a silence learning to wait. A rumor can spark from the tiniest sparks of envy, but once fanned long enough through office hallways, it can burn down even the truest of feelings. After the New York trip, Autumn returned to Boston with a heart still echoing with unnamed sounds. She didn't call it love. She didn't dare call it hope. But she knew. Something had changed. Lucas remained as always, punctual, precise, maintaining just the right professional distance. Yet in the way his eyes lingered when he looked at her and the subtle delay of his nod when giving instructions, there was something no longer belonging to a CEO with his assistant. They had a silent agreement to keep everything in its proper place at the proper limit, at least within the office walls. But the world around them didn't stay silent. 2 weeks after the trip, Autumn began to notice the stares. At first, just passing glances, but soon whispers trailed her into the break room. Smirks followed her to the copier. Casual questions sharpened with hidden edges. How was New York? The deal went well. You gotta travel with the CEO. Must mean you've got some special skills, huh? One afternoon as she stepped into the break room, she heard Rebecca's voice. Sweet, but sharp as a blade. "I'm just saying, usually an assistant doesn't accompany the CEO to major negotiations, especially someone who's been here less than 3 months. Another voice added, "I heard she presented pretty well." Rebecca gave a low laugh. Who wouldn't present well with the CEO staring at her like every mistake could be forgiven? Autumn froze. Her coffee trembled in her hand. She turned and left quietly, her chest tight. Later that day, Lucas stopped by her desk. "Where's the report I asked for?" he said, voice steady. She handed over the folder, but said nothing more. Lucas frowned, watching her closely. Her face looked nothing like usual. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, just a little tired." Lucas hesitated. "My office is empty. If you need a few minutes." Autumn looked at him. In that moment, she wanted to step into that office. Not to rest, but to lay her head on a shoulder she knew would feel safe. But instead, she forced a faint smile. "Thanks. I'm fine." The next day, an unmarked envelope appeared on her desk. Inside were photographs. She and Lucas standing close outside the hotel, his hand on her back as they crossed the street. Another shot of them at an Italian restaurant, leaning in eyes carrying something impossible to disguise. At the bottom lay a slip of paper written in bold black ink. Someone is always watching, and not everyone sees this as trustworthy. Autumn felt the blood drain from her body. Her hands trembled. Her heart pounded violently, not because she feared being caught, but because the truth had been twisted. She knew her feelings were real, but in someone else's hands they were now evidence. She carried the photos into the restroom, sat down on a closed toilet seat door, locked. The vent hummed above her like the whispers of an office tearing her apart. She wondered, am I destroying something good? She didn't believe she was wrong, but that didn't stop rumors from becoming weapons. Monday morning, she was summoned to the boardroom. Inside were 3 people, Charles the chairman, Patricia head of HR, and someone from legal. "We need to have a serious conversation," Charles began. "About your personal relationship with Mr. Bradford." Autumn swallowed. "I don't understand." Patricia slid the stack of photos across the table toward her. Autumn didn't need to look. She already knew. "That doesn't affect my work," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Whether it affects your work or not isn't your decision," Charles replied coldly. "We need clarity." The door opened again. Lucas walked in. He looked at the table, then at Autumn, and he understood everything. Charles stood. "Lucas, we must discuss." Lucas cut him off, his eyes fixed on Autumn. "No need. If someone must take responsibility, I will. This relationship is not favoritism. She earned her position by refusing to run from hardship." Patricia interjected, "Lucas, if this continues, then I'm ready to walk away," Lucas said firmly. Autumn's head snapped toward him, shocked. "You can't." "I can," he said. "And if they can't see your value, then they don't deserve to have me." The room fell silent. Autumn's throat tightened. Her heart pounded so hard it could burst. Not from fear, but because, for the first time, someone stood for her. even at the cost of everything. There are loves not written with roses and candlelight, but carved deep through storms, doubts, and the choices between loss and courage. That afternoon, Autumn quietly packed up her desk. No one told her to leave. There was no termination letter, but after the board's interrogation after Lucas stood up for her, even to the point of offering his resignation, she knew she couldn't let him sacrifice everything just because of feelings they hadn't even named. A handwritten note lay neatly on Lucas's desk beside the contract she had been editing that very morning. "Thank you for believing in me, but I can't let you lose everything because of emotions we haven't even had time to call love." Autumn walked out while the office buzzed with typing, scattered laughter, and eyes that couldn't meet hers. No one stopped her, except the ache inside her chest. 3 days later, Lucas sat alone in his office, sunlight streaming in without warmth. Autumn wasn't answering his calls. She wasn't replying to his emails. Her light footsteps were gone from outside his glass door. He had never imagined that the absence of one person could make a space feel so wide and so unbearably silent. On the third afternoon, Lucas sought out Mrs. Langley, the elderly gardener who once lent Autumn her umbrella on a stormy day. "Where did she go?" he asked, voice low. The woman just smiled, her eyes filled with gentle knowing. "She once told me, when her mind is tangled, she returns to the place that taught her to believe in kindness." Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he left. That evening, he stopped his car in front of a small community center in Roxbury, the one Autumn had once mentioned volunteering at during college. Children's laughter spilled from the reading room. He stepped inside, his heart pounding. Not as a CEO, but like a young man searching for something he'd lost. Through the glass, he saw her. Autumn sat in the middle of a circle of kids reading aloud with different voices. A wheezy fairy godmother, a squeaky lazy cat, sending the children into fits of laughter. She was still herself, real alive, radiant enough to light the room without a single lamp. Lucas didn't walk in right away. He just stood there, watching, and for the first time, he realized that longing could take on a shape. When the children ran off for snacks, Autumn looked up and saw him. Her heart dropped. Lucas, he was here. Not as the CEO, not as the powerful man, just as someone softened by 3 days of not finding her. She stepped into the hallway. They stood facing each other. Neither spoke first. At last, Lucas broke the silence, his voice rough. "I've been looking for you for 3 days. I know," Autumn whispered. "I just needed time." Lucas nodded, his eyes holding hers, as though if he blinked she'd disappear. "I don't regret standing up for you, and I would regret it if that cost you everything you've built," Autumn said, her voice breaking. Lucas moved closer, not quickly, but with the patience of a man who understood that what mattered was never rushed. "Autumn," he hesitated, then continued, "business is something I know how to rebuild. But this feeling, what you've given me, I can't." She finally lifted her eyes to his, and in that look, all the rumors, the reports, the whispers behind their backs vanished. What remained was truth, that what existed between them had always been real. Lucas pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket. "I didn't resign. The board is divided, but some of them are beginning to see what you've accomplished. More importantly, they see I'm not weaker, but more human since you've been here." Autumn exhaled, for the first time a soft, unforced breath. "So, you're still CEO?" "Yes." Lucas smiled faintly. "But tonight I'm not here as a CEO." "Then who are you?" she asked, lips curving. "The man who wants you to come back." Autumn smiled, small, tender like the last sunlight breaking through clouds. "I didn't leave because I didn't need you," she said. "I left because I needed to know. If what we have can exist even when we're not standing side by side every day." Lucas extended his hand, open, patient, without pressure. Autumn looked at it and took it. They didn't kiss in the hallway, didn't embrace like in the movies. They simply held hands, lightly, but enough to know neither would walk alone anymore. There are moments that need no words, only a glance. And there are promises that need no vows, only two hands holding tight in the face of doubt, never letting go. 6 months later, it was a clear spring day, the Boston sky bright and blue, as if the whole city had just awakened from the long sleep of winter. On a stretch of white sand by the bay, rows of white chairs were neatly arranged, each one adorned with a sprig of baby's breath. The waves whispered softly like the sea itself, offering blessings. Behind a white lace canopy, Autumn stood in her wedding dress, simple, graceful, as unassuming as she was. No grand ball gown, no sweeping veil, and no shoes. She smiled as she looked down at her bare feet pressed into the soft sand. Emma, her best friend and maid of honor, laughed when she caught Autumn sighing playfully. "You're about to get married, but it looks like you're debuting your new collection, Me and the Beach Sand." Autumn shrugged her eyes, glimmering with mischief. "It's my brand, Barefoot. It started with an interview, and now it ends with vows." "No, not ends," Emma squeezed her hand. "It's a beginning, a very Autumn kind of beginning." Outside, Lucas Bradford, no longer the cold CEO of boardrooms, adjusted his collar. He wasn't wearing a stiff black tuxedo, but a sand-colored suit, a crisp white shirt, no tie, and a small wildflower pinned to his lapel. The sea breeze tousled a few strands of hair over his forehead. Jake, his best man and closest friend, watched him quietly. "Nervous?" Lucas shook his head, though his hand tightened slightly. "Not nervous, just the first time I don't need to be sure of everything." Jake patted his shoulder. "Well, who would have thought our icy CEO standing here waiting for a barefoot girl? No title, no contract." Lucas chuckled softly. "No contracts. She's the only commitment I never want to renegotiate." The gentle music began. Autumn emerged from behind the canopy. Her hair flowed loosely with a delicate braid tucked across the back. In her hands was a bouquet of wildflowers, lavender baby's breath, a touch of white daisies. She looked exactly like herself, tender, simple, real. Lucas turned, and in that moment, the entire beach blurred. All he saw was a barefoot girl, and the man who had finally learned to let go of the world just to hold on to her. The ceremony was brief. No minister, no elaborate rituals. Just a friend officiating and a circle of the people who truly mattered. When it came time for vows, Lucas spoke first. "Autumn, you walked into my life like a strange wind, quiet, uninvited, but strong enough to topple everything I thought was unshakable. You never tried to change me. You simply made me want to be the best version of myself. I promise not only to hold your hand on warm days, but also on the days you need someone to hold you up. And I promise, no matter how many heels break in this life, I will always be the one to walk barefoot with you to the end." The guest chuckled softly, then fell silent again. Autumn looked at him, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She answered slowly, "Lucas, I once thought you were someone I could never understand. But I forgot. Sometimes to understand someone, all you need is the courage to stay when they are silent. I promise never to turn our love into a battle to win, but into a journey to live, to listen, to share. And I promise, no matter how many rumors, how many doubtful eyes, I will still choose you, today, tomorrow, and every day after that." When they exchanged the rings, simple unadorned bands with each other's names engraved inside, the wind rose, the waves drew closer, but in that moment all sound disappeared. There was only them and a world unfolding. Lucas leaned down, this time without hesitation. Autumn rose onto her toes. No more retreat. They kissed. Not the fiery kiss of movies, but an affirmation quiet and sure. "I am here, and you are here, not because the world accepts us, but because we chose each other. Life doesn't need to be perfect to be worth living. It only needs to be real enough to make us want to stay, whether in chaos or in the quietest of moments." After the wedding, Autumn and Lucas's life didn't turn into a fairy tale the way people often dream. They still argued about who should do the dishes. Lucas still had nights when he brought work home, and Autumn still managed to lose her car keys 3 times in the very first month of being a wife. But between all those small imperfections lay countless quiet joys. The mornings when Lucas made breakfast, even if it was just toast and coffee. The way his eyes followed her when she spoke with Mrs. Langley, the elderly gardener, as though it were the most important conversation in the world. The fact that Autumn still wandered barefoot around the house and Lucas never once complained, only placing a pair of slippers quietly by the sofa each night. 3 months after the wedding, on a gentle sunny morning, Autumn stood before the mirror holding a pregnancy test. 2 lines. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming before she even knew if they were from fear or from joy. Lucas found her later sitting quietly in the kitchen, her tea cold. She simply held the test out to him, said nothing. He looked, then lifted his gaze to hers. Slowly his expression shifted, from surprise to awe to quiet, trembling tenderness. He bent down and pressed his lips to her forehead. A promise without words. "We're about to begin a new chapter," he whispered. Autumn nodded, still crying softly. "Are you sure?" she murmured. Lucas held her gaze as if engraving her face into his heart all over again. "I've been sure since the first time I saw you walk into that boardroom, barefoot and unapologetic." 1 year later, on a soft afternoon, Autumn sat in a rocking chair by the window, cradling a baby girl in her arms. The child's eyes the stormy gray blue of Lucas, but sparkling with mischief, like her mother's. Lucas came in, set his briefcase down, and quietly stepped closer. "Our little girl's asleep," he whispered. Autumn nodded, patting the baby's back gently. "You know," she said softly, "if someone had ever told me that one day I'd marry a CEO, live in an apartment with a fireplace and fresh flowers every week, I would have laughed in their face." Lucas smiled, sitting beside her. "And if someone had told me my heart would be healed by a barefoot girl who showed up to an interview with nothing but courage, I wouldn't have believed it. Not until it happened. They didn't have a perfect life, but they had each other. From a collision on the street, from a broken heel, from misunderstandings, battles, and unspoken lines they didn't dare cross, to a hand held through rumors, a vow whispered against the waves, and a child sleeping peacefully in their arms. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive in what we prepare for. It arrives in the choice to stay, when every reason tells you to walk away.